computed the measures of dispersion for the state murder rate for each of the 4 regions separately. What do we do with this information, and what does it tell us? What you have before you is a table where I report the descriptive statistics by region for the state murder rate. You'll notice that I've computed the median and the mean, and we reported the range, interquartile range, the variance, and standard deviation for each of the 4 regions. The first thing to notice does a typical state look like for each of these 4 regions? We'll examine the median and mean in this table to answer this question. In terms of median, we see the Northeast and the West have what appear to be the lowest murder rates, while the Southeast has clearly the highest. This same picture is presented when we look at the mean. But when we compare the mean and median, we notice something else. With the mean being substantially higher in the Southeast than its median, that suggests that the Southeast is skewed in a positive fashion. While the mean may not be the best measure of central tendency with the Southeast in this case, we'll notice that it means for the Northeast and Midwestern regions are virtually identical, which indicates that these 2 samples are likely very symmetric. The South state is a little bit larger than its median, which suggests that it has a positive skew, but I wouldn't say it was a very large positive skew. In any respect, though, what we see is clearly 2 distributions that have symmetric shape, and clearly one that has a rather obvious, pronounced positive skew. Now, when we report this information, we don't then report the mean for the Northeast and the West, and then report the median for the Southeast. We report and compare the same measure of central tendency. In this situation, I would probably spend most time discussing the mean and indicating that the Northeast has the lowest murder rate, while the Southeast has clearly the highest murder rate. Means for this variable. But we do want to keep in mind that the Southeast does have a positive skew, which I'll talk about a little bit later on. Now let's turn to the second question. That is, how do the other cases in the sample how do the other cases in our samples cluster around the typical case as indicated by the median? The range and interquartile range are 2 basic measures of dispersion, and what we notice here is that the range for the Northeast is far lower than the range is for the other regions, especially in comparison to the Southeast. Given that we have that the states in the Northeast are all clustered very closely together in terms of murder rate, while the Southeast has a much wider spread. But keep in mind the range is very sensitive to one unusually large score in a sample. For that reason, the interquartile range may be a better basic measure of dispersion. As we see here, however, there appears to be far less spread among the middle 50% of the distribution. Far less spread among the cases in the Southeast region, suggesting that the range is heavily influenced by 1 or 2 unusual scores for that sample. Other than that, we see that the Southeast and Northeast are more closely clustered together, while the Midwest and the West are a little bit more widely spread apart. These distributions. So while there may be for the Southeast and a little bit for the Midwest and West, a couple of cases that may differ a good bit from the mean for those samples, we see that the middle of each of these distributions are fairly tightly close, but more commonly are reporting the variance. However, are more commonly reported than is the interquartile range, especially the standard deviation. And let's talk about that since the variance gives a similar depiction. What we see here is that the region that has the most tightly clustered set of cases around the mean is the Northeast, with a standard deviation of only 1.35. 0.39, and we interpret this as the typical amount of spread of each case of a state in the Northeast from the mean for that sample is 1.39 murders per 100,000 population. You notice that the spread for the Southeast is quite a bit higher, with a standard deviation of 4.6, which we interpret as the typical distance of a state in the Southeast from its sample mean of in the Southeast from the mean for that region is about 4.76 murders per 100,000 population. The variance in the standard deviation can be influenced by one or two unusual cases. And we saw that one we indicated had a much higher skew, given that the mean and median were farther apart than we saw for the other regions. And that leads me to be concerned. The range and the standard deviation are really a proper reflection of what the Southeast looks like in terms of its distribution for murder rate. So what I'll do now is take a look at the Southeast a little more closely to see if it's just one case that results in a depiction of the distribution of the southeastern states that really is not an accurate reflection of the rest of the states. The measures of dispersion for the southeastern states, the District of Columbia had a murder rate that was twice as high as the next highest. Clearly a very large case for that sample. So what I've done here now is I've reported the descriptive statistics for the southeastern region without the District of Columbia in that first line, so we can compare it to the second line, the values that we computed early on, to ask the question, is it that one state, the District of Columbia, that really throws off the information that we have and provides an inaccurate depiction of what the Southeast looks like in terms of murder rate? Well, what we see here is the median doesn't change much. This is what we expected. But notice the mean. The mean drops considerably. Now we see, without including the District of Columbia, the mean and median are very close to one another, suggesting that there's very little positive skew now. Also, we notice the range is much lower. The interquartile range is a little bit lower, but we didn't expect it to be as sensitive as what the range is to that one case, the District of Columbia. And now look at the variance in standard deviation. The standard deviation is less than half of what it was when District of Columbia was included in. This tells me that my descriptive measures for the mean, the range, and the standard deviation variance are being heavily influenced by just that one case, the District of Columbia. Not being any cases out of any analysis. What I would say in this instance, the District of Columbia does not belong in the analysis for the states, for the southeastern region. And we can see that for a couple of reasons. First of all, it is such an anomaly in terms of its murder rate for any of the other states in the rest of the nation. Secondly, we can Columbia stands out apart from the rest of our cases in our sample. It is not a state, and we know that its demographic attributes are very different than what we see throughout the rest of the country. So it clearly is an anomaly. A third reason, and this may be one of the most important ones, it's common for scholars who study states to not include the District of Columbia because it is so unusual. So the norm within the field of state analysis does support the idea of leaving the District of Columbia out of most analyses. Is the first table and now report the summary statistics for the southeastern region excluding the District of Columbia. We notice here that while the South still seems to have a higher murder rate than we see when we look at the northeastern region, we notice that the variation among southern states is not quite as large as what we saw before. And in fact, the variation is a little bit larger when we look at the standard deviation than the northeastern region, and smaller than what we see in terms of the Midwest and western states. This indicates that while the Southeast may on average have state murder rates that are higher than the other regions, we see that there's a fair amount of uniformity or homogeneity among the southeastern states in terms of the low standard deviation of 1.9. That the Northeast is a safer region in terms of murder rates, and the states in the Northeast do not vary much from one another. In contrast, the Southeast seems a bit riskier, with higher murder rates, and those states seem to also be clustered rather closely together. So that region really does differ from the others, especially when we compare it to the Northeast. And it's not just a function of one or two cases that make it look that way. Differ from one another would not have been as clear had we not compared and examined all the descriptive statistics at one point in time as we do here in this one table. This is why it's really important to not only know the data, but to look at all the statistics together to get a sense of what does the distribution look like for each one of these samples. Clearly, if we had left the District of Columbia in our analysis, we would have had a picture of the southeastern region as standing far different from the others. That would have been a function of merely just the District of Columbia being such an anomaly in our data.